With AMD's Vega 56 coming down in price, and the price of every other graphics card going up, is AMD's flagship of yesteryear actually not a bad idea? Or is it in fact still a tad terrible? Right, so after a good few years, I've only managed to go and get hold of one because I put a cheap bid on a Vega 56 graphics card just as a bit of a joke to see if we could get it for that price because they're holding their price well. But I bought this MSI Radeon RX Vega 56 for £56, which in itself wasn't too difficult to actually do. All I did was whack a bid on there and thought I'd see how much we could actually get it for. I've always been fascinated by these because you'd imagine they'd be a bit like the R9 Fury, where they've aged pretty well and they came into their own. Price-wise, they've been in a bit of a weird spot for a while because they got such stiff competition from Nvidia from the 1070 and even the 1080 on the higher end, and now those prices are crashing. These have sort of been stuck in limbo for most of 2025, selling for about the £50 to £70 region. So let's get this thing open, see if it actually works, because £56, believe it or not, is actually a good deal for one of these. And you never know, for £56, maybe this is quite a lot of graphics card. I don't know if it's arrived in box, I don't know anything about condition, all I know is it said this was an MSI one. I believe it may be a bit like a reference model. Yeah, it's not a Vega box, that's for sure. Well, we've just found out why they sold their Vega 56, unless we managed to get a 5060 Ti for £56, which whoever bought this clearly likes their 56s, because they've gone from a Vega 56 to a 5060. This is not what I ordered, but yeah, this is a 16 gig 5060 Ti box. You can't make this stuff up because there's no way that I've ever bought a 5060 Ti. We've only ever made it to the RTX 40 series on this channel. We do have something RTX 5000 coming this Christmas though. Right, what have we actually got inside? Is it a 5060 Ti? Is this video going to take a turn? No, that's a Vega 56 right there. But, to be fair, at least they've shipped it in a box. Did they leave anything else in here? No. Right, so Vega 56. Someone's decided these are worth upgrading from now, but that still leaves an entire section of the market where this is actually not a bad idea. So what have we got? We've got the MSI Air Boost. Running a Vega card or Vega chipset from such a small blower cooler seems like an interesting choice, probably why this was so cheap. We've also got a little switch thing, red or blue. I'm not going to touch that. It's got a couple of little switch pins down there to change between red or blue. It's probably got RGB something. It's clean though, so whoever owned this clearly actually liked their graphics cards. Right, let's plug this thing in. Vega 56, I have some interesting thoughts because everything seemed a little bit exciting in this time in the market. Polaris was good, Pascal was good from Nvidia. It was just the high end from AMD we were waiting for. To be fair, this isn't a Radeon 7, this was the entry level to their high end. This was what you bought if you wanted a high-end graphics card from AMD and didn't want to pay for the 64 or the very rare Vega 7? Radeon 7. So let's go plug this thing in. So I know some people class the R9 Fury as a bit of a disappointment, but as we covered on this channel, as someone that bought one, they got cheap, and they got cheap fast. The Vega series from AMD, this is as cheap as they've managed to get, because at the time these came out, well, the issue was, there was the whole GPU mining crisis, and this was 8 gigs of HBM, I believe, which is still pretty competent for computing tasks that aren't gaming. You know, to AI acceleration, Bitcoin mining. These were pretty good, and you couldn't get them because of that. So let's plug this thing in. They also had the worst marketing campaign in existence. Do I believe there might be an undervolting tutorial in this video for Vega? There might be. I'd imagine it'll be the same as doing it on the R9 Fury and probably Polaris, because I'd imagine these suffer from the same issue all AMD cards of the era do, which is where there's tons of voltage crammed into it. They probably run dead hot and dead slow out of the box until you tweak them, because AMD. It's a shame because we did just test the GTX 1060 and I was just so impressed how well set up those were out of the box, unlike this era from AMD. I am also curious how a blower cooler is holding up, because anytime you see one of these reviewed, it's usually one of the pretty decent coolers. Now a little bit for the moment moment of truth. Does our cheap Vega 56 turn on? Got a red MSI light. Fan noise would indicate it's doing something. And it's on. Now I know there's modded drivers for these, but we're going to start off with just standard, normal AMD provided drivers. We'll probably do some modded driver testing at the end, as we have been doing with these AMD cards, because there's benefits and there's drawbacks. RX Vega Series, so 3 months old on the drivers, which isn't too bad. And then in a second, we can get our Vega graphics card drivers. So I did just double check things, and it was running slightly slower in that bottom slot than it should, so I've moved it back up and just secured it with a screw. It does just about fit. It's just a bit of a balancing act to get it in the port but over those SATA ports. The thing is, the RX cards have just flooded the market so much that they are just the definitive go-to purchase. But there's been a distinct lack of anyone really talking about Vega. It does have me curious that if you grab these for sort of that mid £50 region, which as we've just seen, you're not going to be getting the best cooler, but you might get one that's been looked after, even if it has got a blower cooler design and is warming up quite dramatically, you might be able to get one quite cheap, which you can't really argue about. At the end of the day, if you get one cheap and it works, but we do have to get this thing run through some benchmarks, because I remember the marketing for these. Poor Volta, which I think at the time was Nvidia's next generation of cards they had coming out, and AMD's marketing team was claiming this was going to beat it. The Vega 56, the Vega 64. It didn't. Actually, it didn't do well. It was not a great release, to be honest. At the time, it was competitive, but the only reason that AMD sold these in the numbers they actually did manage to sell these in is because they were excellent for mining and compute tasks. And to be fair, to a degree, as I've said, they are still excellent for compute tasks, but it's now competing in a used market where the RX 580, which is good enough for 90% of people in the market, is in the £20 to £40 region. The GTX 1070, I've seen those going quite cheap. In fact, the main people you're going to be selling these to are probably people looking at the 1060 and going, well, if I'm going to spend 60 quid, maybe I can get one of these? But at that point, you're also trying to convince them they don't want a 1070, which is also, by extension, a great graphics card. We haven't looked at one on the channel yet, but come on, they've got a good enough reputation that I'm fairly sure we can trust it. It's just a weird one, isn't it? Because it could be excellent. It could have aged brilliantly like the RX 580 has. Maybe these are just bad. I don't know. I've never owned one before, and I've not really watched much testing since they came out. So let's see. We've got these installed. Let's just double check GPU-Z, make sure this is actually running at the right PCIe speed. Now it's in the top lane. Okay, yes, that is running at full 16 times now. On paper, it's not too bad. 2017 release date. They were held back quite a bit from the initial launch of the other cards. Up to date 2025. 8 gigs of HBM. Now, we know how much HBM carried on the R9 Fury. It should be pretty good because you also get, by extension, that huge 2048-bit memory bus. So in terms of actual memory capabilities, this thing is still on another level. 3,584 shaders. You could unlock them via BIOS flashing. It's not running too hot. It's running at 26 degrees. Yeah, it all checks out. It is RX Vega, 64 ROPs, 224 TMUs, 8 gigs HBM. Yeah, this hasn't been unlocked. Don't know what I was thinking about there. Let's get 3D Mark running and see what it does when it's actually under some load. Now, call me insane, but I do think a good degree of appeal for these cards, it's going to have to be novelty factor, because it's the same reason some people absolutely love things like the R9 Nano, because you get stupid flagship power in a weird package. And to be fair, this is essentially the next generation of the Fury line. The only one that really excites me is the Radeon 7, because it was the only thing they had as an actual high-end card. As much as this was meant to be the entry level to high-end, when you don't offer the full high-end, this is your high-end, if that makes sense. There's a lot of words there, but I think that actually made sense for what I was trying to say. So yeah, I do think there is going to be a portion of the market that will be interested in Vega because they're building a cheap PC, and you know what, maybe they want something that isn't the obvious choice. I mean, to be fair, in our experience, the AMD drivers have been very, very solid. We've not tested them specifically on Vega yet, but at the same time, we've tested them enough to know they should be good. I'm sure there are people getting these cheaper than this. I bid £56. I'm sure I could have got it slightly cheaper if I bid in the last few seconds, but I've had people tell me this was a good deal. And it doesn't seem to be an uncommon deal. It's a lot easier to get these than it is to get 1070s. And with the used market, you buy what is available to you. You can just get one of these from CEX for £70. I'll throw up the current price. But I want to say last time I looked, it was about £70 for one of these. Okay, performance out of the box is looking good. I've got a sort of inclination that this thing's going to run hot. with too much voltage and probably limited boost clocks. Probably the cheapest Vega design I've actually seen. I didn't know they went this low end. Thing is, I'm saying all this, but it has just opened up MSI Afterburner in the top left corner. It's not running hot, it's running at about 50 degrees. I thought it'd be up to like 60, 70 degrees now, but maybe it's not actually a bad design. I was just gonna let this run through without talking, but then it popped up with the temperatures and I thought, hang on a second, that's really good. Performance is also really good. So very much as predicted, our score was 6,987. Which is dramatically lower than the average. So overall graphics score 6,664. Nothing's to do with temperatures. In fact, temperature-wise, only 50 degrees. But our GPU clock frequency is a tad all over the place, to be honest. Yeah, it's just going everywhere. See if we can do a little bit of undervolting real quick, see if we can get things running. We're probably going to need a more intensive stress test. And it likely explains why this one went for quite a reasonable price. It's in good condition, it's working well, it's not getting hot, but it's struggling in other areas. Right, so we got our frequencies there. What are we seeing for voltages? 1200 at the top end. Can we just do 1100 across the board? It's staying fine. 1050 also fine, brings our power consumption just south of 200 watts. Well, that doesn't help me at all, because apparently the stock clocks are 1,471. We're already at 1,538. So maybe it is just power limited. Right, we'll save that profile. Vega 56 undervolt. So all I've done there was I copied the figure here, paste, 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 and then reduced it down, paste, 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 brought up the overall clocks a little bit, increased our power limit. We've dropped about 45-50 watts in power consumption, and it's running stable. So we'll see if it can survive running through 3D Mark like this. It's the same undervolt procedure I pretty much do on all AMD cards that let me, whether it's a Fury, R9285, the RX 400-500 series. So is everyone that's running one of these running one that's tuned through 3D Mark, which is why our performance is so much lower than everyone else's? It could be that everyone is just running these tuned and we are idiots that aren't. It's not getting hot though, it's staying at 61 degrees. It is very cold, it's a very efficient card. But at the same time, you didn't have to do this on a 1060. You didn't have to do this at all. And I'd imagine for the 1070, it'll be the exact same. There'll probably be a video at some point, but you've got to want to tweak these cards to get the performance you can out of them, because you're just limited out of the box, even on an aftermarket one like this, that's already got its clocks increased from factory, only by a few percentage. Such a wild one, isn't it? AMD. So yes, even with just the tiniest little bit of testing, tweaking really, we've now gone up to around where the average is. In fact, we're pretty much now bang on where average performance is. I'd say we could do a little bit more here, but as long as our clocks are stable, hovering about in the same region, it's not fluctuating like it was before, so I'm going to call that a win, and we'll say that's about as set up as we need it to be. Credit to MSI, I didn't think you could make a blower design that's one, this quiet, and two, this thermally efficient. Because it's only getting up to 65, it got up to 68 degrees, it's absolute maximum. And that's with it running the increased power limit. I'm happy with that. We are now in line with average performance. I'm assuming the average on 3D Mark is purely from people trying to get the performance you should out of it. They're doing what I'm doing here, because I've gone with a very lazy, very quick undervolt, and we are now in line with everyone else. So I'm happy with that, and I'm going to call that successful. So we're now ready to get on with the bulk of the video. Now, some people are probably going to say there's extra performance that I am missing out on, and that I could push this overclock further. Well, I did attempt to. I wasn't recording any narration for it, but I was actually going through and trying to get some extra performance out of it. And the problem is, when you get to this point with Vega, when you're not just doing a lazy undervolt for the performance it should be getting, well, overclocking these cards is very much the same as the R9 Fury. There is wiggle room there, but a lot of it comes down to tweaking memory very precisely, tweaking boost clocks and core clocks very precisely. You're going to get most of your performance benefits from doing what I did, increasing the power limit and simply reducing the amount of power it needs to hit the clocks it wants. So when I did try and run it through 3D Mark again, we returned, no surprise here, a lower score, despite everything on paper technically being higher. It's just the way things go with these cards sometimes.
So for peace of mind, you're probably best off, if you are looking at a Vega 56, going ahead and just doing what I was doing here, unless you are into the more hardcore overclocking scene. In terms of performance, at least out of the box, how does our Vega 56 compare? Well, the closest card that we've actually tested that it performs to is an RTX 3050, and it's not bad to compare it to that. I mean, it did score 1000 points higher after an undervolt, which was certainly necessary to actually get the performance we should be getting, but it gives you a rough ballpark figure. That's a newer card and a newer architecture with some additional features, so in reality, I wouldn't be surprised if they do perform quite similar. In terms of comparison to older flagships, it does decimate the R9 Fury by about 2,500 points, not as much as I was expecting, but it means the Fury's still hanging in there pretty well, and compared to the lower end cards of its own era, such as the 1060 and the RX 580, well, it's comfortably 2,000 points above those as well. So it's pretty good to see that, you know, out of the box it is performing about where I expected it to. Newer flagships like the RTX 2080 Super and the Radeon 6700 XT do tend to actually show that, compared to modern day cards, well, even Vega is struggling. But all of these performance figures and numbers do mean very little unless we of course take into account the specifications of the Vega 56, because at the time, well, it sounded like a good entry level into the high-end world. I mean, look at the specifications in front of you now. GCN 5 based on a Vega 10 XL variant, which should on paper be good. GCN was a decent architecture, and with Polaris, I think people were expecting big things. But of course, it's mostly more of a successor to AMD's Fiji, you know, the GCN 3 based cards that we don't shut up about here, including 8 gigs of HBM memory, a stonking great 2048-bit memory bus because of this, but now in 2025, this is only receiving bug fixes from AMD, and even then I'm not too sure it's getting any more than the version we're running today. It has 3,584 cores, 224 TMUs, 64 ROPs, full support DirectX 12 and Vulkan. You're not going to get ray tracing or any fancy effects like that here. This is before any of that even existed. So it's pretty decent. Power consumption is around 190 to 270 watts, and I do have the exact figures and some more undervolting challenges later on in the video. Price-wise, you can pick them up for around £50 to £70, and it's the same in most regions, whether it's euros or dollars. These cards tend to be going for the same price, where they're in this weird middle ground where most people in this market are probably going to settle for an RX 580 or a GTX 1060, but there may be a couple of people that want to stretch the budget a little bit higher. They don't want to go for the current high-end or brand new entry-level low-end, they want to go for something that's in the middle, and that's precisely where the RX Vega 56 sits, right next to a used GTX 1070. And that probably is enough waffling already about the Vega 56. See, it's a bit of a weird one, because Vega was actually quite a good range for AMD's iGPUs. When they were whacking these things into little APU combinations, Vega was pretty cool. We've all seen Vega 3, Vega 6, Vega 12 I think it is, which works so well in laptop and mini PC packages. But because those were so good, people quite quickly forgot that Vega 56, Vega 64, and by extension the very rare flagship version, Radeon 7, even existed. In many ways, at least the R9 Fury had its moment, but unless you were heavily into mining Bitcoin, did Vega 56 ever really get its moment? Because when it launched, stock quickly disappeared and it wasn't into the hands of people that were actively going to use these for games. It was into the hands of people that wanted them for their out-and-out compute performance, because you've got 8GB of HBM memory. Anyway, today we are testing on the latest AMD drivers. There is some modded driver testing later on in the video, and a little brief section in the benchmarks coming up. Today we are testing with a Ryzen 7 3700X, 32GB of RAM. Anything that you need to know is this system isn't going to bottleneck a Vega 56. So we can already get that out of the way. The processor is never going to be a limit in these benchmarks, but where I've not been stating that, I get certain comments telling me it is. Trust me, it is not. But anyway, the Vega 56. Is it AMD's calling card now? After how many years has it been? 8 years. Where, you know, we've seen cards from 8 years ago come into their own when they get cheap on the market, but Vega 56 isn't one we hear about. So let's find out if maybe it is a good buy with the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition running with ultra settings and HBAO enabled in a 1440p resolution. Now, I'm not really surprised at this performance here because we've seen decent 1440p performance from even the lower end AMD cards of this era, such as the RX 580. But we did actually achieve a better experience here that was more stable overall, with 59 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 51 FPS. Now, some people say I'm insane for noticing this, but with the HBM memory, I do notice less pop-in. Apparently there shouldn't be that, but I've noticed there is less pop-in when using these HBM memory cards, and with 8GB of it here, well, we've got plenty of buffer room for a lot of games, allowing us to run these ultra settings in these higher resolutions. So GTA 5 Enhanced Edition was a pretty good place to start off with, and you can crank up everything as high as it goes with all the additional options turned on. You just can't touch the ray tracing because, of course, you don't have that here. Moving things back a little bit to the legacy port of GTA 5, which of course is still exceptionally popular, and you have no problems running this whatsoever. Makes sense, this card is from 2017 and the original port for PC is from 2015, so it should be able to handle this absolutely fine. In fact, I believe this was targeting being able to run the game at 4K, 60fps, so it's no surprise here with ultra settings AMD CHS shadows in 1440p, you've got 88fps here, and you've still got plenty of headroom available. Now, don't get me wrong, heavier scenes and situations would bring your frame rate back down to the 60fps region, but once again, not really any problems with the Vega 56 here. So it's not too much of a problem, but this one's a given that it should run well. What was interesting though was seeing GTA Online with the legacy version here pretty much running bang on where I expected it to. Once again, optimization does go out the window even on these cards with 8GB of HBM memory, but as you can see, it is filling up that VRAM quite nicely compared to the single player games, so it does have some benefits here. The only downside is, this is GTA Online with over 16 players, and optimization utilization go out the window. So we did see 100% utilization in some places when not much was going on, but for most of the actual GTA Online experience, utilization of the card hovered around the 60 to 80% region. That's still better than some cards we've tested, but then again, this is the legacy version of GTA Online. We always know it has optimization and utilization issues, but Vega 56 has enough brute power to just carry on through it. Next up, to see how Vega 56 deals with the modern world and AAA titles, we have Oblivion Remastered, which we were running with the medium settings that it auto-detected, plus screen space reflections, which for some reason it turned off when I used the auto-detect feature. We are running the game in 1080p, not 1440p, and the reason for this, well, it just runs better at 1080p, and we did have to lock the frame rate externally using MSI Afterburner, because the built-in frame rate cap just gave us a ton of stuttering and hitches. Really, playing the game with a 30fps cap is the best way of playing it on these Vega cards, and yes, you could use FSR or a feature like that, but honestly, it just looks so ghosty and horrible in this title. I can just about put up with the TAA, but honestly, FSR here, you could get away with using it if you wanted to run the game in 1440p or even 4K with the right settings, but for me, this is the raw performance of the card, this is what it's about, medium settings, 1080p, 30fps, it's still kicking, it's just beginning to struggle. Now, we always love to see BeamNG running because it can be a remarkably intensive game and an incredibly popular one too. So with a mixture of high and ultra settings in 1440p, this card dealt with it perfectly fine. Its VRAM was filling up quite nicely, showing that 8GB, well, even in these smaller titles like BeamNG, can be a challenge for 1440p resolutions and higher when you just have 8GB available. Seems ridiculous because it's very rare we actually have 8GB of VRAM to test on this channel, but it does show where the limitations lie. Still, this was the highest we could go with the game still being playable. Full ultra settings in this resolution once again filled up the VRAM too much, and although a respectable average, the 1% lows went all over the place. So BeamNG is playable, but you're going to have to configure these settings between high and ultra until you get the game as playable as this. Continuing with the theme of great 1440p gaming, we have Mountain Blade Bannerlord running with high and very high settings in 1440p. It was predominantly using very high settings, including things like textures turned on to very high, the effects, the shaders, but these are the settings the game defaulted to with its auto-detect feature, and honestly, I swear at this point they have profiles for virtually every graphics card in existence. But still, even with these high settings and high resolution, we returned 83 FPS with 1% lows down to 58 FPS throughout the built-in benchmark. Once again, this is very reminiscent of the late game, so a lot of the early to mid game sees you seeing anywhere from 100 to 140 FPS in this title. So Bannerlord is playable, and honestly, you could probably whack things up to 4K without too much of a performance hit. Counter-Strike 2 was definitely a bit of a curiosity for me, because people that want to get into competitive gaming on the cheap are going to want to push very high frame rates, and being able to do so cheaply is quite nice. So with competitive settings in 1440p, we saw 268 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 159 FPS. It's worth noting that during the first run of the benchmark, as seems to be the case with all AMD cards, only a few Nvidia cards suffer with this from my testing, where you have to play through the benchmark once, and you'll get a load of stuttering and all the things out of the way before you can continue with a relatively stutter-free experience. This will also happen when you change settings. Who knows, I'm going to guess it's shader caching or something like that. It's something to do with the AMD side because it doesn't tend to happen as much on Nvidia. Anyway, I'm rambling at this point. Competitive settings netted us a very competitive frame rate, and turning things up to high did bring us down to 196 FPS with 1% lows down to 139 FPS. In both instances, whether you are playing with competitive settings or high settings in the 1440p resolution, your frame rate in-game would be liable to be higher than it was throughout the built-in benchmark. So in terms of a good cheap card for Counter-Strike, well, it is a good one if you're looking to play it in high resolutions on the cheap. If you're only playing in 1080p, well, you're better off just going with an RX 580 to be honest, aren't you? Now, Cyberpunk 2077, I had a nightmare getting this game to start. No matter what I did, I could not get in-game. If I loaded the benchmark, it would load for 10 minutes and just do nothing. If I tried to go in-game, it would have a fatal error. Turns out this is something to do with the latest drivers and certain models of Vega cards. Not all of them are affected, but it seems since the launch of this game, some of the AMD cards just have issues getting in-game. Once we resolved this issue with modded drivers, trust me, more on that later, this did actually bring things back. The strangest thing is though, after I went through and actually run the modded drivers, I thought, you know what, we'll go back and try the stock drivers again, and miraculously it worked fine, so no clue what's going on there. Weird Vega driver quirks, at least we know that happens now. But with medium and high settings in 1440p, the game does run fantastically with 48 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 43 FPS. Just, you're going to have some weird driver quirks on probably some of the reference models. Baldur's Gate 3 seems to be suffering in the same way that it does on all AMD GCN cards, where you can't run the game with the Vulkan renderer for too long, or it simply just crashes. So you're stuck using high settings in DirectX 11, which returns you a pretty solid average and it will calm down eventually, but your 1% lows are down to 32 FPS, and this was during a good situation. I'd imagine later on in the game this will become more severe. Unfortunately, it just seems to be an issue with this game and AMD cards, where the DirectX 11 renderer just returns you frame times that can be completely all over the place, and this traces back to even AMD's Terascale. So unfortunately, Baldur's Gate 3, well, if it's any Terascale or GCN-based cards, it's just completely unplayable, unfortunately. I mean, you could go away with a 30 FPS cap, so maybe I am being a bit harsh there, but we saw better performance than this from a GTX 1060 3GB last week. Just a fun test that I like to do just to see how it's holding up with the world's most intensive source game, with Black Mesa running at Zen levels with ultra settings, and it's also a good test to see how these cards deal with older DirectX 9 based titles. And with a 1440p resolution, performance was definitely struggling in places with 138 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 111. That's right, Black Mesa running with ultra settings is more intensive than Counter-Strike 2. But then again, just look at how far this game is pushing the Source engine. It does look absolutely fantastic. I know I'm saying the card's struggling, but let's be honest, this frame rate is fine. But you're not going to be hitting 144 FPS consistently throughout Black Mesa Zen levels, even on a Vega 56. Red Dead Redemption 2 actually proved a joy to set up for once. Why? Because we had 8GB of memory and it wasn't telling me I'm using too much of it all the time. Still, the game defaulted to a mixture of high and ultra settings utilizing the DirectX 12 renderer in a 1440p resolution. And when I jumped in game, honestly, it detected things just about right here. I have to give Red Dead Redemption 2, as much as I hate benchmarking the game, if you are running a card with enough VRAM, it does tend to guess your settings pretty well, and it did a good job here. This was the slider nearly almost at maximum, and it returned 49 FPS on average and really solid stable frame times down to 45 FPS. So Red Dead Redemption 2, pretty much perfect in all instances, and it looks great with these settings as well. Absolutely no surprise here with Hitman 3, which tends to work absolutely beautifully on all cards we've tested it on. It defaulted itself to high settings and the best simulation options, which can prove to be an absolute nightmare for certain cards. There tends to be a lot of particle effects going on during parts of this benchmark, and I have seen plenty of cards that should do better struggle. But fortunately, with that absolutely monstrous memory bus and 8GB of HBM, this really isn't a problem. This is where this architecture it just excels, same as the Fury did. Vega is carrying on this tradition. When you are pushing a ton of particle effects and the fill rate and everything's being pulled on this card, well, you're seeing the performance here, 1440p, we're seeing 70 FPS on average, and 1% lows that hardly drop below this. When this card is optimized for a title, it returns some exceptionally good frame times. It's just a shame that not all games are Hitman 3. City Skylines 1 tends to be people's preferred city builder, so we might as well include it here. And despite the card actually seeing very little utilization, this is likely down to the fact this is a Unity title, and it's so questionably optimized, but people love seeing it as a benchmark. But here, with high settings in 1440p, it did return a pleasant 47 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 43 FPS. Honestly, you could probably put the resolution up higher than this, and it'd probably return you the exact same frame rate. Our utilization was so low. It was utilizing the HBM relatively well, which I'd imagine is why this is probably some of the smoothest frame times we've seen in this game, but the visuals are lackluster. I did actually get too much gameplay of this. It's been a while since we've had City Skylines 1 this playable on the channel, so the town has been expanded even more with about 12 minutes of gameplay of City Skylines. So playable, but once again, this game's to blame, not Vega 56. As it would happen, Rust is actually a surprisingly memory-intensive game. With high settings in 1440p, even utilising that 8GB of HBM which it was using in its entirety, it still took the world a good few seconds to load in properly. There were a few invisible mountains giving us temporary wall hacks when we spawned into the world. And through a mixture of gameplay and the game's built-in benchmark, we saw 63 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 55 FPS, which honestly, for those of you that know Rust, know that that is a really good frame rate to be getting back from this. Usually this game does suffer a lot with frame rate instability in certain places, especially with these higher settings. But once again, Vega 56 has this on its side. It has HBM, 8GB of it through a monstrous memory bus. So in these situations where you end up with these questionably optimized titles that are just hammering away on the memory, well, the card inherently deals with it very well. Talking about things running well though, and we have Fallout 4 running with ultra settings in 1440p, returning 72 FPS on average, and this is during one of the more intensive areas in the game, with lots of things going on, lots of god rays and lots of nonsense that usually brings performance down to a crawl and causing rapid amounts of instability. But here on Vega 56, Well, it does well. I have to give it credit here. I don't know if there's been some updates to this game that might have actually helped performance, but it's very rare that we see this game actually run properly. It's also very rare that we see the game actually utilize VSync down to 72 FPS rather than capping itself somewhere in the 30 FPS region. This tends to be an issue with the engine and higher resolutions and higher refresh displays, but for once it seemed to do something that almost made sense. So I'm going to give Fallout a lot of credit here. Vega 56 plays it very well. But finally, can it run Crysis? As we've seen, all modern Nvidia cards have trouble launching the DirectX 10 version, so being able to even launch the game here means you pretty much get an automatic win. And can Vega 56 do it? Well, it takes a few minutes for the frame rate to stabilize down properly, but it can run the game with ultra settings with DirectX 10 in 1440p and return 70 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 58 FPS. Now, of course, these figures are taken during very heavy combat and action, as they should be, but when you actually do get into smaller and lighter areas, the game will even run between 90 and 110 FPS. So Crysis, well, Vega 56 deals with it very well, and given the Nvidia cards it's up against can no longer launch the game properly, technically Vega 56 beats the GTX 1080 Ti here. So now for the nitty gritty, how was the overall performance of the Vega 56? And it certainly is a bit of an interesting one, because if we look at the big graph of all the titles, we can still see that there's plenty of games it excels at. We can see it's still hanging in there with new games like Oblivion Remastered still being playable with a decent array of settings at a locked 30 FPS, so it is still a capable gaming graphics card. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself this: is it actually worth warranting the price increase going for a Vega 56 over something like an RX 580? I'd include the GTX 1060 in there, but honestly those are actually so expensive still that you can probably pick up a Vega 56 over those, and we can quite comfortably see here, yes, the performance is better than that. But against its lower end sibling from the Polaris generation, well, performance is better, but it's not exactly a monumentally huge increase that I was expecting. I mean, that was very much the same sentiment people had back in the day, and it sort of rings true now, because Vega's not really come into its own the same way that the R9 Fury did over some of its lower end competition. And with prices on them still strong, well, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because I can't argue, we got some great performance here today, especially in a 1440p resolution. But then it's also another point of contention, because someone that's going to be gaming, well, chances are they're buying the best monitor and setup they can, and it's probably a 1080p one, not a 1440p one, and it's just the price increase to go a step up in resolution on monitor to get the graphics card like this. Well, you're almost entering the other ballpark of, should you focus on more aspects of your budget PC than getting one of these? Not to mention some of the driver side issues we ran into, which either aren't there on Polaris or definitely aren't there on the Nvidia side of things. I really do like the performance where it shines through. When this card is good, it is excellent thanks to that HBM. But in other titles where you think it'd do better, it's either drivers or the pricing that lets it down. And those are my genuinely honest thoughts on the overall performance. But there was something Vega was really good at, because it wasn't AMD's Polaris they decided to use in their APUs, was it? No, it was AMD's Vega with the Vega 3 and upwards. And when we've tested those before, well, even though it was a contemporary review when they actually just bought out the Radeon 200 GE, and I've got a bit of experience with the APUs after that as well, it was an incredibly power-efficient architecture. But just how are things when you look at power consumption from the actual perspective of the full-on flagship? Well, just out of the box, power consumption is ridiculous. Full load at 289 watts, gaming at 261, and even running a light workload was bringing out 132 watts. But AMD went on to prove that it can be a power-efficient architecture, and even here with an undervolt, well, it actually is quite a power-efficient architecture, utilising 191 watts while gaming, and now down to 78 watts under a light load. But this information by itself is interesting, but it's nothing that we wouldn't have already known from undervolting tests. One test that I do like to incorporate now, since, what about last week, is how power efficient can we make some of these graphics cards? Because the idea that maybe this architecture could be scaled down and used in a budget PC on a lightweight power supply, well, that opens up some new ideas. And you've noticed that green line on the graph. That is the maximum undervolt I was able to achieve while getting some performance out of the card and having it still being stable. And that included it gaming at just 60 watts of power. And how good is the performance at 60 watts? Well, it's nowhere near as good as the performance is with just a normal undervolt. But what it is exceptionally good performance for a graphics card that's pretty much using no power at all. Take GTA 5 Enhanced Edition. I ran the game with the same ultra settings that we were using, but scaled the resolution back to 1080p. And the game was still playable. Don't get me wrong, there was a few areas where there was lots of heavy draw calls with lots of grass going on, and you could probably turn that down to very high and you wouldn't drop under 30 FPS. But at the end of the day, you can use the Vega 56 as a very power efficient card that can play GTA 5 Enhanced Edition at ultra settings 1080p 30 FPS, which is quite admirable. So Vega 56 can be very power efficient, but please, if you do have one of these or you're looking at buying one, never use it with its stock settings. You get worse performance and nearly 300 watts of power consumption under its full load. Now, there are some other aspects of the card to talk about. Some people will of course say, well, you've got AMD VCE on there, and I do usually include encoder testing in these reviews if the cards include it. It's not as exciting as it used to be, because back when I was originally doing these, well, for some people it was their main way into streaming when their processor couldn't do it. But with the rise of multi-core and the fact that every GPU's got an encoder in it now, it's not quite as flashy as it used to be. Performance is good from the encoder when using the indistinguishable preset in OBS, and it looked alright. I mean, it's nothing to write home about, but it's nothing to complain about either, and it'll work for your handbrake or VCE encoding tasks. When you start lowering the bitrate beneath this, I did a 2000 kilobit per second render test utilizing AMD VCE at a quality preset, and it works okay. I mean, generally you shouldn't be streaming at 50 FPS with resolutions and bitrates this low, but at the end of the day it does go to show that AMD's Vega, well, it can be used for streaming or recording, but honestly, given its power consumption, unless you were undervolting this massively, it's not really worth even considering it as a media center card, because once again, Intel has so many good options, they've sort of cornered that part of the market. So yes, AMD's Vega can be pretty good for some media center tasks, but once again, why would you? The thing is though, every time that AMD's Vega, or by extension any AMD graphics card comes up, the conversation of modified drivers usually enters the conversation, with some people swearing by them and other people not exactly being all too interested. So I usually take it upon myself to actually go through and benchmark all the games in the suite, including the modded drivers. And it does have to be said that there was some increases where it mattered, but some also big decreases in performance for older titles primarily. Titles like GTA 5 and GTA Online did see a slight uptick in performance. The main one that of course saw a big boost was Counter-Strike 2, we always see that with these modded drivers, and then across the board there wasn't much to write home about other than some big losses in Fallout 4 and Crysis. Now, it's worth giving these drivers credit where it's due. At the end of the day, they did allow me to launch Cyberpunk 2077, but then after I ran DDU, got rid of these, and then went back to the stock drivers, we were able to run Cyberpunk again anyway, so I have no idea what was going on with those AMD drivers. It might be repeatable. If anyone's had any experiences like this, I'd imagine quite a few people using Vega cards since launch would have, then could you please let me know. At the end of the day, modded drivers will be important if you're into your multiplayer or competitive titles, but across the board, if you're not playing those, you're probably better off sticking with the stock AMD drivers, at least until they become too old to be supported, when hopefully the modified drivers will really come into their own. A bit like how they have on those older GCN cards like the R9 Fury and the ones that are prior to that. So there we have it, AMD's Vega 56. And I've been wanting to review one pretty much since they came out, because as people have noticed, I was a big fan of the R9 Fury, I had a good time with it, and it should be on paper Just a great card. It should be the successor to that. And as time's gone on, we know the benefits of HBM in games, we know the benefits of this architecture and its longevity, but then again, the R9 Fury has drivers that are up to date as of a couple of years ago, maybe even more recent than that, but that is an older card than this, and it pretty much cuts off at the same date. Don't get me wrong, this card does have optimizations for newer titles that do count for things, but it doesn't fix some titles like Baldur's Gate 3. But anyway, performance isn't the point, I've already spoken about performance. I don't think Vega 56 is a bad card. If you are looking for something on the used market that pops up frequently to give you solid 1440p performance, get you by for a couple of months, maybe you want to do some compute heavy tasks where that HBM will be helpful, then I think it's going to be a good card to go for. But at the same time, if you're just someone buying a cheap graphics card because you want good performance, well, why not save the money and get an RX 580? That might be a controversial opinion, but generally the person on a budget isn't going to be gaming at 1440p. They're probably gaming at 1080p, in which case the RX 580 can still return a great experience in all the games we've tested, even Oblivion Remastered. So it is a tricky one. I think if you can get one of these cheap and you're looking for almost flagship performance of the yesteryear, it's not a bad idea. But then again, I do also need to get hold of the GTX 1070 that can be found. Admittedly, it's easier to get a Vega card this cheap than it is to get a 1070, but I've seen them sell in this region before. It's a tricky one, isn't it? I don't think Vega 56 is a bad card, but I think given it never had the chance to become a bargain, a lot of people are going to struggle to look at this card favourably. I'm not someone that had one back in the day and can go, you know what, I got some good years out of that. I'm someone looking in on it from the perspective of, well, I couldn't afford it when it was new, and now that I can just about afford to get hold of one, I'm not blown away, but I think it's admirable. I think it's okay. So Vega 56. I don't think it's good, I don't think it's bad, I think it's simply an okay choice. And I hope everyone's happy with that conclusion, because it's tricky for me to say anything else. But anyway, thank you all very much for watching, and good night.